I gave my ex one last chance. Biggest mistake of my life. I told myself I was doing it for closure. That's the lie I clung to when I unlocked my phone at 1:47 a.m. and reread her message for the fifth time. Can we talk, just once? I promise I'm different now. It was short, careful, the way someone writes when they're afraid the wrong word might slam a door forever. I stared at the screen like it might blink back first, like the decision wasn't already made the second I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Closure. That's what I called it. What it really was hope wearing a disguise. Her name alone still did things to me. Not butterflies, those were long gone, but something heavier. A dull pressure, like an old bruise you forget about until someone presses it by accident. We had been broken up for almost a year. 11 months of no contact, if you don't count the occasional accidental like on a story, or the mutual friend who didn't mean to mention her. 11 months of convincing myself I was fine, that I was better off, that the version of me she knew no longer existed. And maybe that part was true, but the version of me that answered sure, when, was very much alive. We met at the same cafe where we used to fight and make up in equal measure. Small place, wooden tables, a bell on the door that rang too loudly every time someone walked in. I arrived early because of course I did. I always did with her. Control disguised as courtesy. I sat with my back against the wall, ordered black coffee, and rehearsed what I would say if she apologized. What I would say if she didn't. What I would say if she cried. I told myself I wouldn't be the one to reach across the table. I told myself I wouldn't let her touch me. Then she walked in. Time didn't rewind the way movies make it seem. It didn't erase the damage or soften the memories. But it did something worse. It made everything feel possible again. She looked healthier, calmer, like someone who had learned how to breathe without taking too much air. When she smiled at me, it wasn't sharp anymore. It was hesitant, earned. And that scared me more than any dramatic entrance ever could. We talked like strangers, pretending not to remember each other too well. Work, life, surface-level truths polished until they were safe. She didn't mention him, because there was always a him after me and I didn't ask. We danced around the past like it was electrified, and maybe it was. But eventually she leaned forward, fingers wrapped tightly around her cup, and said my name the way she used to when she needed something. That was my first mistake. I didn't interrupt her. "I know I don't deserve this," she said. "I know I hurt you. I know I broke things I can't unbreak, but I've been in therapy. I've been alone, like actually alone, and I see it now. I see what I did to you." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. Not because she was convincing, but because the idea that all of it had meaning, that the pain had led somewhere, was easier than accepting it had just been damage for nothing. She didn't blame me. That was new. She didn't rewrite history. She owned it. Or at least she sounded like she did. "I'm not asking you to jump back in," she said quickly. I want a chance to do it right, slowly, on your terms." My terms. The phrase echoed in my head like a gift I didn't trust. I told her I wasn't ready. I told her I had walls now. I told her I didn't know if I could ever look at her without remembering the nights I couldn't sleep because I didn't know where she was or who she was lying next to. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. Another red flag disguised as growth. We left separately. That should have been the end of it, a clean cut, a mature conversation, something I could look back on and say I handled that well. Instead, I replayed her words all night, her tone, the way she didn't ask for forgiveness, just opportunity. And the next day when she texted "thank you for hearing me out," I replied without thinking. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed them to be. Careful, measured, almost professional. We set boundaries like contracts. No sleepovers, no labels, total honesty. If something felt off, we said it, and for a while it worked. Or at least it looked like it did. She checked in. She asked before touching me. She listened when I said no. She made space instead of demands. It was intoxicating seeing someone treat you right after they once treated you terribly. It tricks your brain into thinking this is evolution, not just restraint. I noticed the cracks before I admitted them to myself. The way she'd flinch when I mentioned certain names. The subtle questions about where I was and who I was with, framed as curiosity but sharpened by anxiety. The moments where her patience slipped just enough for me to see the old reflexes underneath. But every time I hesitated, she adjusted. Every time I pulled back, she leaned away first. And that made me feel like the villain. So I took the next step. I let my guard down one notch. I invited her over. I let her sit on my couch in my space, surrounded by the version of me she hadn't earned yet. When she rested her head on my shoulder, I didn't move. When she said she missed me, I didn't correct her. I told myself I was being brave. What I was really doing was ignoring my instincts because they were inconvenient. The night we slept together again wasn't explosive or romantic. It was quiet, familiar, almost sad. Afterwards, she traced patterns on my chest and whispered, "I won't mess this up." I didn't say anything. I stared at the ceiling and felt something inside me tighten, not with fear but with recognition. I had been here before. Different words. Same promise. By the time she left in the morning, I had already made the decision that would unravel me. I was going to try. Fully. I was going to believe her. I was going to give her the one thing I swore I never would again. One last chance. And I had no idea how much it was going to cost me. I told myself the unease I felt after she left that morning was just my body adjusting to something familiar after a long absence. I cleaned the apartment more than necessary, opened windows even though it was cold, erased every physical trace of her like that would somehow reset my nervous system. When she texted later asking if I was okay, I waited an hour before replying even though my phone had been in my hand the entire time. Yeah, just a lot on my mind. It was the truth, just not the whole one. From that day on, we slid back into each other's routines with a speed that should have alarmed me. Coffee dates turned into shared groceries. Your place or mine replaced are you free? And somewhere in between, I stopped questioning whether this was healthy and started focusing on whether it felt good enough. She was attentive in ways she never had been before. She remembered small things, asked before assuming, apologized quickly when she crossed a line. Every correct move she made felt like a stitch closing an old wound, and I let myself believe healing could happen faster if both people wanted it badly enough. But there was a quiet shift happening under the surface, subtle enough that I ignored it at first. She started referring to the future again. Not directly, nothing as obvious as plans or commitments, but in those casual hypotheticals that sneak past your defenses. If we went there again, when you meet my cousin, next time we do this together. Each one landed like a test. I didn't correct her. That was mistake number two. I thought staying silent was neutrality. She took it as permission. The first argument came out of nowhere, which should have been my clue that it had actually been building for a while. We were at the grocery store, standing in the cereal aisle, when she asked who I'd been texting earlier. Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was a tightness behind it I recognized instantly. I answered honestly. A coworker. She nodded, smiled, then reached for a box and said, "Funny, you never used to text coworkers that much." It was a small comment, a nothing comment, but it flipped a switch in me. Suddenly I was back in the old dynamic where every harmless detail was quietly cataloged and later presented as evidence. I told her she was reading into things. She said she wasn't accusing me of anything. I said it felt like she was. She went quiet, the kind of quiet that's designed to make you fill the space with apologies. And I did. I apologized for snapping, for being defensive, for not being more reassuring. I didn't apologize for existing, but it felt close enough. On the drive back, she reached for my hand and said, "I just don't want to lose you again." That sentence did more damage than any accusation ever could, because it reframed the situation so cleanly. Her insecurity became my responsibility, and I accepted it without realizing I had a choice. From then on, I noticed myself adjusting. Not dramatically, just enough to keep things smooth. Mentioning plans before she asked, reassuring her preemptively, softening truths so they wouldn't sound like threats. Every relationship requires compromise, I told myself. This was just me being considerate. The problem was, the balance was already tilting and I was the only one shifting my weight. She began showing up more often without asking, framing it as spontaneity, as missing me. If I hesitated, she'd smile and say, "It's okay if you need space." But her eyes would say something else entirely. And once again, I'd cave. I didn't want to be the reason she felt unwanted. I didn't want to undo the progress she claimed to have made. So I let her back into corners of my life I hadn't planned on reopening. She met friends I'd kept separate for a reason. She lingered longer at gatherings, correcting my stories, finishing my sentences, reminding everyone of memories I wasn't sure we should still be sharing. When someone joked about us being back together, she didn't deny it. She just looked at me with that same careful smile and waited. I laughed it off. She remembered that too. The night everything shifted, we were lying in bed, lights off, the room filled with that heavy silence that only exists when one person is thinking very hard and the other is pretending not to notice. She asked me if I loved her, just like that. No build-up, no warning. My heart started pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. She rolled onto her side, away from me, and said, "I knew it." Not angry, not loud, just resigned. That was worse. I told her I cared about her deeply, that I was still processing things, that I didn't want to lie just to make her feel better. She nodded, but something hardened in her after that, like a decision had been made without my input. The next morning, she was distant but polite, already moving pieces into place while I was still trying to understand the board. Over the following weeks, her behavior changed in ways that were hard to call out without sounding paranoid. She was warmer in public, colder in private, quick to praise me in front of others, quick to question me when we were alone. She started making jokes at my expense, small digs framed as humor, but if I reacted, she'd accuse me of being sensitive. "I thought you liked honesty now," she'd say, like that was a shared value and not a weapon she was learning how to wield. I began doubting my reactions, wondering if I was projecting the past onto the present. After all, hadn't she changed? Wasn't I the one who agreed to try again? Maybe this discomfort was just the price of rebuilding something broken. Maybe trust felt like this when it was being relearned. The thought that kept creeping in, the one I refused to say out loud, was far simpler and far more terrifying. Maybe she hadn't changed at all. Maybe she just learned how to hide it better. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as exhaustion. I was tired all the time, not physically but mentally, like my brain was constantly running background checks on my own behavior. Every sentence I spoke felt like it needed pre-approval. Every plan required explanation. If I came home quieter than usual, she'd ask what was wrong. If I was in a good mood, she'd ask why. There was no neutral state anymore. Everything meant something, and she was determined to decode it. When I tried to talk about it, she listened with that calm, practiced expression that made me feel like I was the unstable one in the room. "I just want to understand you," she'd say. "You're the one who keeps pulling away." And maybe I was, but only because every time I stood still, she moved closer until there was nowhere left to breathe. The first time I caught her lying, it was over something so insignificant that I almost laughed. She said she hadn't spoken to her ex in months. I hadn't asked. She volunteered the information, which immediately raised a flag. Later that week, I saw his name flash on her phone when she handed it to me to show a picture. She snatched it back so quickly it was almost comical. When I asked her about it, she didn't deny it. She reframed it. "He reached out. I didn't want to worry you." There it was, that familiar twist. The lie became an act of consideration. My discomfort became proof of my insecurity. I told her honesty mattered more than reassurance. She cried, said she was scared of losing me. I comforted her. Somewhere in that exchange, the roles reversed so smoothly I didn't notice until later. I was the one apologizing again. After that, the monitoring started. Not overtly, nothing that would justify calling it control, but enough that I felt watched. She'd casually mention things I hadn't told her, ask about people she shouldn't have known I'd seen. When I questioned how she knew, she'd shrug and say mutual friends talk. Maybe they did. Maybe she'd just gotten better at hiding the effort. I started limiting what I shared, which only made her push harder. "Why don't you tell me things anymore?" she asked one night, eyes glossy with accusation disguised as hurt. I wanted to scream that I didn't feel safe doing so, but the word safe felt too dramatic, too heavy. So I swallowed it and said I didn't know. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than the truth ever could have. The breaking point wasn't a fight. It was a moment of clarity so sharp it felt like betrayal, to her, to myself, to the version of me that had tried so hard to believe. We were at a small gathering with friends, sitting across the table from each other while conversations overlapped. Someone asked how we'd gotten back together. Before I could answer, she laughed and said, "He finally realized he couldn't do better." The room chuckled. I smiled reflexively, but something inside me went cold. It wasn't just the joke, it was the ease with which she diminished me, the confidence that I'd accept it. Later, when I told her it bothered me, she rolled her eyes. "You're reading too much into it. Everyone knows I'm kidding." I asked why the joke had to come at my expense. She sighed like a teacher dealing with a slow student. "God, you've changed," she said. "You used to be stronger than this." That sentence echoed in my head for days. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed something. She didn't miss me. She missed the version of me that tolerated her worst instincts. The version that absorbed blame so she didn't have to sit with it. The version that made her feel powerful without asking for anything in return. And I realized then that giving her another chance hadn't been about redemption. It had been about access. Access to my time, my attention, my emotional labor. She hadn't come back to fix what she broke. She'd come back to see if it was still broken enough to use. I started pulling away for real after that, not dramatically, not with ultimatums, just small acts of reclaiming myself, saying no without explanation, making plans without checking in, letting silence exist without rushing to fill it. She noticed immediately. Her tone shifted, her patience thinned. The careful mask she'd been wearing began to crack. Accusations crept back in, sharper now, less disguised. "You're hiding something. You don't care like you used to. Why are you acting like this?" I didn't argue, I didn't defend, and that terrified her more than any confrontation ever had. The night she finally exploded, she listed everything she'd done for me, every compromise, every change, every sacrifice. It sounded rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to present the bill. I listened quietly until she finished, then said something I hadn't planned but couldn't take back. "None of that matters if you never actually changed." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Her face hardened. And in that moment I knew I hadn't just disappointed her. I had threatened the story she told herself about who she was now. And she wasn't going to let that go without a fight. The fight didn't explode the way I expected it to. There was no yelling at first, no slammed doors or raised voices. Instead, she went very still, like an animal deciding whether to flee or attack. Her eyes stayed on me, unblinking, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm in a way that made my skin crawl. "So you think I'm the same person," she said, not a question, a verdict. I told her I thought she'd learned new behaviors, not new intentions. That was the wrong thing to say. She laughed once, sharp and humorless, then stood up and began packing the room. What followed was a masterclass in revisionist history. Every mistake she'd ever made was reframed as a reaction to something I'd done. Every time she'd hurt me became proof of how deeply she'd cared. She accused me of holding the past over her head, of punishing her for trying, of being emotionally unavailable now that things were real. When I didn't interrupt, she took that as confirmation. Silence to her was guilt. She told me I was afraid of commitment, that I sabotaged good things, that I'd led her on. Each sentence was delivered with confidence, as if repetition could turn accusation into fact. And the worst part was, some of it almost sounded reasonable. That's how manipulation works when it's done well. It borrows pieces of the truth and rearranges them until you don't recognize the original shape. When she finally stopped talking, she looked at me like she expected an apology. I didn't give her one. I told her I wasn't interested in debating who was more damaged. I told her I was tired of feeling like I was on trial in my own relationship. Her expression changed instantly. The calm shattered. The tears came fast and loud, the kind meant to overwhelm. She accused me of abandoning her, of giving up just when she needed reassurance. She said she'd built her entire sense of safety around us trying again. That sentence landed like a threat wrapped in vulnerability. Suddenly, leaving didn't just make me selfish, it made me dangerous. I stayed that night, not because I believed her, but because I didn't trust what would happen if I didn't. That realization should have scared me more than it did. Over the next few days, she alternated between extremes. Affection so intense it felt performative, followed by cold withdrawal if I didn't respond the way she wanted. Gifts appeared, small, symbolic things tied to memories we shared, like proof she was still capable of tenderness. Then came the guilt, subtle reminders of how much effort she was putting in, how fragile she felt, how easily I could undo everything by walking away. I began feeling trapped by my own empathy. Every boundary I tried to set was met with emotional consequences I didn't have the energy to manage. Friends noticed I was quieter, more distracted. When they asked if everything was okay, I said yes without hesitation. I didn't want to explain something that already felt confusing to me. And deep down, there was shame. Shame that I had let this happen again, that I had known better and still stepped back into the fire. The breaking moment came on an ordinary afternoon. I was at work when my phone started buzzing nonstop. Missed calls, messages piling up faster than I could read them. They escalated from concern to accusation in minutes. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering? I know you're ignoring me." I stepped outside and called her. She answered immediately, already crying. She said she'd had a panic attack, that she needed me, that I should have known. When I asked how I was supposed to know, she screamed that if I really loved her, I'd always know. Something snapped then, not in anger, but in clarity. I told her I couldn't be her emergency system. I told her I wasn't responsible for regulating her emotions. The silence on the other end was brief, then icy. "So that's it," she said. "You're just like everyone else." She hung up before I could respond. That night, she posted vague messages online about betrayal and being used. People I barely knew started checking in on her. I realized she was building a narrative, one where she was the victim and I was the final proof that love always leaves. When I confronted her about it, she denied it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If the shoe fits," she said. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about control, about winning the story. And she was willing to burn me down if it meant she didn't have to face herself. I told her I needed space, real space. She agreed too quickly, which should have warned me, because people who thrive on chaos don't let go quietly, they just change tactics. The space I asked for never really existed. Physically, yes, we stopped seeing each other every day. Emotionally, she followed me everywhere. She respected the boundary just enough to claim she was respecting it while finding ways to slip past it whenever she felt like it. A message here, a memory there. A song sent with no context, just enough to remind me she was still present, still watching. If I didn't respond, she'd wait a day and then send something casual like nothing was wrong. It was psychological erosion, slow and deliberate. I started dreading the sound of my phone. I muted notifications and felt guilty for the relief it brought. Friends told me to block her. I said it wasn't that simple. And it wasn't not because I couldn't, but because part of me still felt responsible for how she'd react if I did. That sense of responsibility had been carefully cultivated over months, and it didn't disappear just because I recognized it. Then she showed up. No warning, no invitation. I opened my door to find her standing there, eyes red, holding a small bag of things she'd left at my place weeks earlier. "I just want to talk," she said. I should have closed the door. Instead, I stepped aside. The conversation spiraled fast. She accused me of abandoning her during her lowest point. I told her I'd asked for space, not disappeared. She said space felt like punishment. I said it was survival. At some point she started crying so hard she slid down the wall and sat on the floor. My instincts kicked in before my logic could catch up. I sat beside her. That was all the invitation she needed. Within minutes she was talking about moving forward, about how this was just a rough patch, about how couples who truly love each other fight through worse. When I pulled back, she stiffened. "So you're really done," she said flatly. I didn't answer right away. I was tired of absolute statements, tired of ultimatums disguised as clarity. That hesitation was enough. She stood up, wiped her face, and something in her eyes went dark. "You know," she said, "I've been protecting you." That sentence didn't make sense at first. Then she explained. She'd been talking to people, mutual friends, people from my past. She'd shared her side, carefully framed to make herself look reasonable and me look unstable. She claimed she'd defended me, that she could have said much worse. The implication hung in the air like a blade. I realized then that my reputation, my relationships were being held hostage by her perception of fairness. I told her that wasn't okay. She shrugged. I did what I had to do, she said. You left me no choice. That was the moment the last bit of affection drained out of me. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was resolve. I told her to leave. She laughed like she didn't believe me. When I didn't move, didn't soften, didn't comfort, she finally understood. Her voice rose. She accused me of using her, of leading her on, of being cold. I didn't argue. I opened the door. She walked past me, then turned and said, "You'll regret this." Not as a threat, as a promise. The fallout was immediate. Friends stopped replying the same way. Invitations slowed. Conversations felt cautious. I could feel the version of me she'd painted moving ahead of me, arriving before I could explain myself. When I tried to set the record straight, it felt defensive, which only confirmed the narrative she'd built. I learned quickly who believed me and who preferred the drama. Losing people hurt, but not as much as realizing how easily they'd been turned. Nights were the worst. Not because I missed her, but because I replayed everything, wondering how I'd let it get that far. How giving someone one last chance had turned into surrendering control over my own life. She still found ways to reach out. Emails from new addresses, messages through acquaintances, always framed as concern, as unfinished business. I ignored them all. Silence became my only defense. And slowly something shifted. The constant tension eased. I slept better. I laughed without checking my phone. The fog began to lift. I saw the relationship clearly for the first time, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson I'd paid dearly for. The biggest mistake of my life hadn't been loving her. It had been believing love alone could fix what accountability never touched. And even then, I didn't yet realize she wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. I thought the worst was over once I stopped responding. I underestimated how hard it is for someone to let go when control slips through their fingers. The silence didn't calm her, it provoked her. What started as scattered attempts to reach me turned into calculated moves designed to force a reaction. She liked my old posts from years ago at 3 in the morning, just visible enough to be noticed. She showed up at places she knew I frequented, never approaching me directly, just close enough to be seen. When I blocked one account, another appeared. Each interaction was subtle enough that explaining it to someone else made me sound paranoid, which I'm sure was the point. The real damage came when she contacted my family. My mother called one evening, concern thick in her voice, asking if I was okay. She said my ex had reached out because she was worried about me, claimed I'd been isolating myself, that I seemed unstable. I felt something hot and sharp settle in my chest. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I told my mother the truth, not every detail, just enough. She believed me, but the fact that the conversation had to happen at all felt like another violation. I sent one final message to my ex, carefully worded and unemotional, telling her to stop contacting me and anyone connected to me. Her response came instantly. Long, emotional, apologetic in tone but not in substance. She claimed she was just trying to help, that I was overreacting, that she still cared. I didn't reply. That was the moment she escalated. Rumors spread quietly at first, then louder. I heard versions of myself I barely recognized, controlling, manipulative, emotionally abusive. Stories where she was afraid of me, where leaving me had been an act of survival. I realized she was doing to me what she'd always feared I'd do to her, rewriting the ending so she could remain the victim. I wanted to fight it, to expose the truth, to show screenshots, messages, timelines. But every instinct told me that engaging would only feed it. I focused on my work, on rebuilding friendships that hadn't been poisoned, on grounding myself in reality when the gaslighting threatened to pull me under. Some nights doubt crept in anyway. I'd replay conversations and wonder if I really had been as cruel as she claimed. That's the most insidious part of it. You start interrogating your own memory. Healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong. Other days I felt hollow. But slowly, consistently, my life began to expand again. I met new people who didn't require me to explain myself constantly, who didn't flinch when I set boundaries, who listened without turning it into leverage. The contrast was jarring. It showed me how much I'd normalized dysfunction. Months passed without hearing from her. I let myself believe she'd finally moved on. Then out of nowhere, I received a message from someone I didn't recognize. It was her new partner. He said he wanted to clear the air. My hands shook as I read his words. He told me she'd confessed that she'd lied about parts of our relationship, that things weren't adding up, that he felt like he was living in the shadow of someone she wouldn't stop talking about. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I kept it brief, neutral. I told him I wasn't interested in revisiting the past and wished him well. He thanked me, said he understood. A week later, she messaged me for the first time in months. She accused me of interfering in her relationship, of trying to sabotage her happiness. I didn't respond. I didn't have to anymore. Her accusations no longer defined me. That was the moment I knew I was free, not because she'd stopped, but because her behavior no longer dictated my reactions. The last chance I'd given her had cost me peace, relationships, and pieces of myself I had to rebuild slowly. But it also taught me something I would carry for the rest of my life. Love without respect isn't love. It's a negotiation where you're always the one paying, and I was done paying. Freedom didn't feel like relief at first. It felt like standing in an empty room after years of constant noise, unsure whether the silence meant safety or danger. I kept waiting for the next disruption, the next message, the next rumor. My body was still braced for impact long after the threat had moved on. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the source is gone. It lingers in habits, in reflexes, in the way you hesitate before trusting your own comfort. I noticed it most when I started dating again. Not seriously, just conversations, coffee, low expectations. Every time someone asked a simple question about my day, I felt the urge to justify my answer. When someone didn't text back immediately, I felt a flicker of panic I had to consciously shut down. It embarrassed me how deeply it had all gotten under my skin, but I forced myself not to retreat. Isolation had been one of her favorite weapons, and I refused to let it become my coping mechanism. I started therapy, something I'd always told myself I didn't need. In that room with someone who had no stake in the story, I said things out loud that finally sounded as bad as they had felt. I learned the language for what I'd lived through: patterns, cycles, emotional coercion. Numbing it didn't erase it, but it stripped it of its power to confuse me. For the first time, I stopped asking whether it had really been that bad and started asking why I'd been willing to tolerate it. That question was harder. The answer wasn't flattering. I had mistaken endurance for strength. I had believed that being patient, understanding, and forgiving made me noble, when in reality it had made me predictable. I had been so focused on not becoming the villain in someone else's story that I'd let myself become one in my own. That realization hurt more than anything she'd ever said to me. As my clarity grew, so did the consequences of my silence. People who had distanced themselves during the fallout began to reappear, cautiously at first. A few apologized. Some didn't. I learned to accept both outcomes without chasing explanations. Not everyone deserves access to your healed self. The most surprising change was how differently I saw her now. Not as a monster, not as a victim, just as someone deeply unwilling to face herself, willing to drag others into that avoidance if it meant she didn't have to sit alone with it. That understanding didn't excuse her behavior, but it freed me from the need to demonize her to justify leaving. One afternoon, months later, I ran into her by chance. No warning, no buildup. Just her standing in line at a bookstore close enough that I could hear her breathing. She looked smaller somehow, tired. When she turned and saw me, her expression flickered through a dozen emotions before settling into something guarded. We exchanged polite nods, nothing more. As I walked away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. No urge to explain, no urge to confront, no urge to prove anything. The chapter was closed, not because she'd agreed to it, but because I had. That was when I finally understood the real cost of giving her one last chance. It wasn't just the time or the pain or the damage control. It was the delay. The months I could have spent building something healthy. The energy I'd poured into managing someone else's chaos instead of investing in my own growth. I didn't regret leaving her. I regretted not leaving sooner. But regret, I learned, is only useful if it sharpens your future decisions. Mine did. I stopped negotiating with red flags. I stopped romanticizing potential. I stopped believing that loving someone meant sacrificing yourself to prove it. The biggest mistake of my life had been confusing familiarity with safety. And the greatest thing I did afterward was refusing to make it twice. Time has a way of flattening even the sharpest memories, but it also clarifies what mattered and what never did. Long after the chaos faded, after the rumors died and the emotional noise quieted, I found myself looking back at that moment when I'd answered her message, the one that started it all, with a strange mix of empathy and detachment. I didn't hate the man who gave her one last chance. I understood him. He was tired, hopeful, and still believed that doing the right thing meant reopening doors that had already proven why they needed to stay shut. He thought love was measured by how much pain you were willing to endure. He was wrong. Life didn't transform overnight after everything ended. There was no dramatic rebirth, no instant happiness, but there was consistency, peace that didn't need to be negotiated, relationships that didn't require constant explanation or vigilance. I learned what it felt like to be trusted without being monitored, to be questioned without being accused, to be loved without being managed. The difference was staggering. It made the past feel smaller, not insignificant but contained, something that belonged to another version of me. Every once in a while, someone new would ask about her. Not directly, just a careful question about why I was so firm about boundaries, why certain behaviors were non-negotiable for me now. I never told the whole story. I didn't need to. The lesson was enough. I had learned that people don't change because you love them harder. They change because they're willing to confront themselves when no one is watching. And if they're not willing to do that, no amount of patience will save you. The irony is that giving her one last chance didn't destroy me. It sharpened me. It forced me to see my own blind spots, my own need to be needed, my own fear of walking away without certainty. It taught me that closure isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you take the moment you stop asking for permission to leave. I don't wonder what she's doing now. I don't replay arguments or rewrite endings. The story ended exactly where it was supposed to, when I chose myself without apology. The biggest mistake of my life wasn't trusting her again. It was thinking that trust, once broken that deeply, could be rebuilt by effort alone. Some bridges aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to be recognized for what they are and left behind without another crossing. And that, finally, is a lesson I won't ever need to learn again. I never expected closure to feel like this. Not triumphant, not dramatic, not vindicating. It was quiet, subtle, almost imperceptible. I noticed it in small things. The way I could leave my phone on the counter without checking it obsessively. The way I laughed freely without measuring her potential reactions. The way I made plans for myself without the nagging question of whether she would approve or feel abandoned. The freedom wasn't about being without her. It was about reclaiming myself from the patterns she had embedded in me, the ones that made me doubt my own instincts, that made me question my own sanity, that made me responsible for her feelings at the expense of my own peace. Looking back now, I realized that giving her one last chance wasn't a failure. It was a catalyst. It forced me to confront truths I might have ignored if things had ended cleanly, to recognize the difference between love and obligation, between compromise and surrender, between intimacy and control. I am stronger now because I endured what I thought I couldn't endure, because I walked away when it was hardest, because I learned to trust myself first. And that ultimately is what no one else can give you. The assurance that you are enough on your own, that your boundaries are valid, that your peace is worth protecting. Love can be devastating, yes. It can tempt you into hope, lure you into patterns that hurt more than they heal. But the real test isn't whether you forgive, it's whether you protect yourself long enough to see clearly. I gave her one last chance, and it nearly cost me everything. I survived it, and in surviving, I finally found the strength to stop repeating the same mistakes. Some lessons are cruel, some love stories are cautionary, and some mistakes, biggest mistakes really, are also the moments that teach you who you are when no one else is watching. I don't regret that last chance anymore. I regret not having learned sooner what I learned at the end. That's enough. That's more than enough.